Hey guys and gals, it's your buddy Drew with Living History's Mysteries. You know, with Thanksgiving just passed a week ago and Christmas coming up in less than 3 weeks, I knew it was time to look in to some of those histories and those mysteries, those origin stories about Christmas, Yule, the feasting, the togetherness, etc. But before I got into that, I wanted to look at another little mystery that's I've always been curious about. You guys know I'm really big into the Viking culture, the history, and of course, reenacting Viking like I do every spring. And I started thinking, what was it like for them in that frozen part of Northern Europe, up in Norway, in Scandinavia, in that whole Norse region? What was it like preparing meals? What was it like storing food? What was the secrets to having those feasts? And what did the feast mean? I mean, was it a feast for the people? Was it a feast for only the highest echelon in the Norse culture? Or was there more to it? Today we're going to take a look at just that. Check this out. This is good.
Snow, silence, hunger. For months, the North lay buried under ice where no crops grew, and the sea slept beneath a sheet of white stone. And yet, against all odds, the Vikings endured, not with abundance, but with intelligence. While empires to the south depended on harvests and trade, the Norse learned to preserve time itself. They created foods that defied the laws of decay, meals capable of lasting months, even years, without spoiling. Each recipe was more than nourishment. It was a fragment of survival science written in smoke, salt, and frost. Modern archaeology has confirmed what the sagas only hinted, that Viking households functioned as living laboratories of preservation. Every flavor told a story of ingenuity, patience, and a relentless will to live. What they lacked in luxury, they compensated for with precision. From fish hardened by the wind to berries that healed wounds, the Viking diet was a catalog of resilience carved into nature itself. These were not mere foods, they were formulas, combinations of heat, cold, and faith that allowed a civilization to conquer the Arctic darkness. And among them all, one ingredient shone brighter than the rest, a fruit so rare and luminous that it became known as the Arctic gold. Far above the fjords, where even the sun seemed to hesitate, a single plant bloomed among the frozen moss, the cloudberry, or multiberry. To the Vikings, it was more than a berry. It was a treasure that grew where life itself had no right to exist. Its color, a deep amber between fire and honey, gave it its name, the gold of the North. Each fruit appeared only for a few short weeks each summer, in wetlands so remote that entire families would travel for days to gather them. They carried carved wooden bowls lined with birch bark, their hands stained orange by the juice, the color of survival. But what made the cloudberry extraordinary wasn't its taste, it was its chemistry. Modern analysis reveals that its acidity and natural antioxidants could preserve it for years without refrigeration. When mixed with honey or stored in seal-fat jars, the berries remained edible through 3 winters. Even after months buried in ice, they kept their glow and their healing power. The Vikings used them to treat scurvy, fever, and exhaustion. Sailors on long voyages were given small pouches of dried cloudberries mixed with barley flour. A primitive but effective source of vitamin C. Archaeological residues of these mixtures have been found in Viking graves across Norway and Iceland, sealed inside horn containers. They weren't offerings, they were provisions for the afterlife. But beyond survival, the cloudberry carried meaning. To Viking women, it symbolized endurance through hardship, beauty born in the coldest place on earth. To warriors, it represented luck. Eating the first cloudberry of summer was believed to ensure safe return from battle. In a world ruled by frost and steel, this fragile fruit became a reminder that even the harshest land could still give life. When explorers reached Greenland and the edge of the Arctic, they carried these golden berries with them, small suns in their packs. They traded them for furs, oil, and amber. The berry became currency, medicine, and myth all at once. And even now, 1,000 years later, the same fruit grows on those northern plains, glimmering under the midnight sun, the last living witness of how the Vikings turned scarcity into strength and nature into ally. Because before there was steel or empire, there was the simple brilliance of a fruit that refused to die. If gold kept them alive through sweetness, the wind gave them flesh. Because in the north, where salt was scarce and winter endless, the Vikings discovered a miracle born of cold and air. Stockfish, cod dried not by fire, but by the breath of the Arctic itself. The process began when the sea still moved, in February, before the fjords froze. Men set out in small boats carved from pine, chasing schools of Atlantic cod near the Lofoten Islands. The fish they caught were giants, their bodies heavy with fat from surviving the polar darkness. These were not just animals. They were gifts from the sea. Once on land, the Vikings began a ritual that bordered on art. The cod were gutted, cleaned, and hung on tall wooden racks called yell, standing like silent skeletons along the cliffs. For 3 months they were left to the wind, exposed to freezing air by night and faint sunlight by day. No fire touched them. No smoke tainted their flesh. The wind itself did the work. Slowly the cod hardened, transforming from raw meat into something between food and stone. Its weight dropped by 80%, but its nutrients remained intact. Protein, calcium, and omega oil sealed within dry, pale muscle. Pure energy, ready to last for years. The Vikings called it the meat of the wind, and they carried it on every journey, from Greenland to the Volga River. A single piece could feed a man for a week. It didn't rot. It didn't mold. It was eternal. Archaeological excavations in Iceland and Norway have unearthed entire warehouses filled with stockfish bones, silent archives of survival. Some still bear knife marks where thin strips were cut, softened with seawater, and chewed for hours while sailing. Others were boiled into stews thickened with barley and herbs. It was humble food, but sacred in its endurance. When European monks first encountered the Vikings, they called the fish Miraculum Maris, the miracle of the sea. They couldn't understand how a people without salt or cellars had mastered preservation beyond anything known to the south. But the answer was simple. They had learned to work with the world, not against it. The same wind that froze their faces dried their food. The same cold that threatened death granted immortality. Even today, stockfish remains one of the few natural foods that can last for decades without spoiling. In northern Norway, families still hang cod in the open air each winter, repeating the same gesture their ancestors performed 1,000 years ago. Each fish sways gently in the wind, like prayer flags of survival. The Vikings didn't invent eternal food. They discovered that eternity was already there, waiting in the wind. And from that discovery, they built a diet, a trade, and a legacy. Because when their sails vanished into the fog, what filled their bellies wasn't luxury, it was logic. Their genius lay not in conquest, but in listening, to the air, to the sea, to the silence between both. And from that silence came nourishment strong enough to carry them across the world. But the North had more secrets buried in its soil. Beyond the fish and the wind, another guardian waited, a tree whose fruit burned red against the snow, holding within it the fire of survival. In the dark forests of Scandinavia, when winter began to bite and the snow consumed the ground, one color refused to fade, a sharp, burning red. It belonged to the berries of the rowan tree, the silent guardian of the North. To the Vikings, this tree was not mere vegetation. It was myth made flesh, a living symbol that connected heaven, earth, and the underworld. They believed that the first woman was shaped from rowan wood, and that the tree itself could repel lightning, illness, and evil spirits. Every part of it was sacred, its bark, its roots, its fruit. The berries appeared when almost nothing else survived. Small, bitter, and bright as drops of blood against the white snow, they became a sign of endurance, of life hidden within death. While other fruits rotted, the rowan's berries froze, thawed, and froze again, concentrating their sugars until they became edible, even raw. It was as if the cold itself had refined them. Women gathered them in midwinter, wrapping the clusters in woven cloth and carrying them home as if carrying light. They boiled the berries with honey and ash to make Roner Drike, the rowan drink, a tonic to fight fever and strengthen the blood. For warriors, it became a potion of protection, consumed before voyages or battles to guard against poison and fear. And for travelers crossing the mountains, rowan branches were tied to their belts to keep death away. Modern biochemistry confirms what their intuition already knew. The berries are rich in vitamin C, iron, and antioxidants, powerful enough to prevent infection and preserve vitality through long winters. Even their bitterness had purpose. It slowed consumption, making the fruit last longer. The Vikings turned survival into ritual, and ritual into memory. In many Viking graves, archaeologists have found rowan seeds sprinkled among the ashes of the dead. They were offerings, yes, but not for the gods. They were for the earth itself, a promise that life would rise again. To bury the berry was to plant hope. A 2018 study in Trondheim revealed microscopic traces of rowan pollen on the teeth of skeletons dated to the 10th century. It meant they had eaten the fruit in their final days, perhaps during famine, perhaps in faith. Even at the edge of death, they reached for what was red, for what reminded them that warmth still existed somewhere in the world. The rowan tree wasn't just a source of food, it was a map of the Viking soul. Beautiful, stubborn, and unwilling to die quietly. It thrived in frost, on cliffs where no other life could root. Just like them. And when spring finally returned, its blossoms were the first to open, white and trembling against the thawing wind. To the north, that sight wasn't decoration. It was prophecy. It said, "You have survived another winter." The Vikings didn't worship the rowan because it was strong. They worshipped it because it was fragile and still refused to fall. But deeper in the valleys, beyond the berries and the trees, another secret grew. A plant that healed hunger itself. Sacred to the gods, powerful enough to feed explorers, and destined to save the sick. They called it Angelica, the herb of the northern gods. In the Arctic, where the horizon is an endless line of frost and silence, only a few plants dared to rise above the snow. Among them was one that seemed almost impossible, tall, luminous, and crowned with pale green blossoms that swayed like halos in the wind. The Vikings called it Kvan. We know it today as Angelica archangelica, the herb of the northern gods. According to legend, the plant was revealed to a Norse healer in a dream during a plague. A spirit, half human, half light, pointed toward a valley where Angelica grew beside the river. When its roots were boiled, the sick began to recover. From that day on, the plant became sacred. It was said that even Odin himself had blessed it, declaring that its scent could drive death away. But behind the myth was truth. Modern research has proven that Angelica contains antibacterial and antifungal compounds, powerful enough to slow infection and preserve food. Its roots hold essential oils that stimulate circulation and strengthen the lungs, a natural remedy for cold, exhaustion, and hunger. To the Vikings, it wasn't just medicine. It was insurance against extinction. They cultivated it near their longhouses, surrounding their homes with rows of Angelica as if building a living shield. Its hollow stems were chewed raw to calm hunger on long voyages, and the seeds were ground into tonic infusions. In Iceland, Angelica leaves were even used to wrap meat and fish, keeping them fresh for weeks, centuries before refrigeration existed. It was one of the few plants capable of surviving Arctic soil, and in return, it helped its people survive the Arctic itself. During famines, families mixed crushed Angelica roots with barley or rye to stretch their flour. The result was bitter, but sustaining. The herb's high sugar content fueled the body like honey, while its volatile oils warmed the blood. A plant that fed, healed, and protected, the perfect companion to gods and men alike. Archaeologists have found traces of angelica in Viking trade settlements as far as the British Isles, Greenland, and even the Volga region. Bundles of dried stems, still tied with sinew, were discovered in shipwrecks, suggesting it was carried across oceans like treasure. It wasn't sold as spice, it was traded as life. In the sagas, angelica was said to grow wherever blood had fallen in battle. Its tall green stalks became symbols of endurance, sprouting from ground once stained with death. Even the monks who later converted the Norse to Christianity adopted the plant, calling it Herba Angelica, believing it had been sent by angels to protect the North from disease. The Vikings never drew a line between healing and faith. For them, every cure was also a prayer, and every plant a message from the world itself. To chew angelica was to remember that nature had not abandoned them. And when the storms came and the nights grew long, the herb's scent filled their houses like incense, sharp, sweet, and alive. It reminded them that the divine was not above the earth, but growing within it, because in the end, the herb of the northern gods wasn't only a medicine for the body, it was medicine for hope. But as the years passed, the Vikings discovered something even more sacred than herbs or berries, a pair of humble grains that built their civilization, the twin pillars of bread and beer. Every civilization is built upon a grain. For Egypt, it was wheat. For Rome, it was spelt. For the North, the land of ice and shadow, it was barley and rye. Two seeds capable of thriving where almost nothing else could grow. The Vikings called barley big and rye rugger, and they treated both not as crops, but as companions. They were the roots of every meal, every ritual, every survival. Without them, there would have been no beer, no bread, and perhaps no Viking world at all. Barley was the stronger of the two, short, stubborn, resistant to frost. Its grains grew golden even under dim sunlight, absorbing warmth from the thin northern summer. The Vikings sowed it in May and harvested in August, racing against the coming snow. Each harvest was a gamble against time. If the first frost came early, an entire year's food vanished overnight. But when the weather favored them, barley became abundance itself. The grains were dried over open fires, crushed between stones, and baked into dense loaves that could last for weeks. Sometimes they were boiled into porridge and mixed with honey and berries, a comfort against the cold. But barley's true power wasn't on the table, it was in the barrel. From barley came öl, the Viking beer, thick, cloudy, and alive with yeast. It wasn't just a drink, it was nutrition, hydration, and ceremony in one. Every sip carried protein, vitamins, and sugar. Liquid bread for a people who spent months at sea. Even children drank weak versions of it, safer than river water. Rye, meanwhile, was the grain of endurance. It rooted deeper than barley, anchoring itself into the cold earth where others died. Its flavor was darker, bitter, but its gift was longevity. Bread made from rye could stay edible for half a year if kept dry. It became the traveler's food, the ration of explorers, and the sustenance of those who wintered in distant lands. Archaeological studies from Hedeby and Borg have uncovered baking pits lined with stone and ash, primitive ovens designed to trap heat and smoke. Inside, residues of barley flour fused with rye crusts still cling to the rock. In some cases, charred pieces of bread were found preserved in the remains of burned longhouses. Proof that even when their homes turned to ash, their food endured. But beyond survival, these grains became symbols of community. During festivals, beer brewed from the first barley of the season was offered to the gods. Each sip was a promise. We have endured another winter. We will endure again. To refuse the drink was to reject life itself. Modern experiments show that Viking beer, brewed in clay pots and fermented with wild yeast, could reach 6 to 8% alcohol, strong enough to disinfect, mild enough to nourish. It was sustenance disguised as celebration. When Christian monks later arrived, they adopted the same recipes, calling the brew Cerevisia Dei, the grain of God. Agag, it was the first quiet alliance between the old faith and the new, forged not in battle, but in fermentation. Barley and rye gave the Vikings more than food. They gave them rhythm. the rhythm of seasons, of sowing and reaping, of scarcity and feast. They taught patience, that life itself was a kind of brewing, a transformation that required both darkness and time. Even now, the scent of malt and smoke still lingers in northern villages each autumn. It's the echo of 1,000 years, a reminder that civilization begins not with swords, but with seeds. But while the earth fed them, the sea fed them even more. Because in the heart of every fjord, the Vikings discovered another source of life, silent, slippery, and infinite. And from it, they learned that the ocean could be both table and temple. When the land froze and the fields turned to stone, the Vikings turned their eyes to the water. The sea, that cold, endless mirror, never truly slept. Beneath its surface, it kept secrets that no famine could touch. Seaweed, shellfish, and saltwater life that pulsed even in the depths of winter. To the Vikings, the ocean was not an enemy. It was a pantry, a healer, and a god. Every tide brought renewal. And from that rhythm, they learned to harvest what others ignored, the hidden gardens of the fjord. Along the rocky coasts of Norway and Iceland, women and children gathered seaweed during the low tides, their hands numb from the icy surf. They called it tang or thang, drying it on stones warmed by the sun. Once crisp, it was stored in clay jars or animal bladders, preserved for months. A handful of dried seaweed could flavor soups, feed livestock, or be chewed raw for strength during long journeys. It was green fire from the sea. What they couldn't grow, the ocean provided. Seaweed was rich in iodine, calcium, and magnesium, the minerals that the frozen soil refused to yield. It prevented goiter, strengthened bones, and replaced the salt they so desperately lacked. Long before chemistry existed, the Vikings had mastered balance through instinct. They didn't extract. They listened. Each wave brought them what they needed to survive. Shellfish, too, were part of this silent feast. Mussels, limpets, and small oysters clung to the rocks like living ornaments, waiting to be pried open with knives of bone and iron. Children gathered them by the hundreds, filling baskets woven from willow. When boiled in seawater and mixed with herbs, their broth became medicine, rich in zinc, iron, and protein. Archaeologists have found entire layers of shell deposits beneath Viking settlements, heaps of mussel, clam, and periwinkle shells, some blackened by fire, others still intact. They were the archaeological fingerprints of daily life, the remains of survival disguised as routine. Even the broken shells were reused, crushed and mixed with clay to strengthen walls, or ground into powder to feed animals. Nothing was wasted. Seaweed in particular had a spiritual dimension. In the sagas, it was said to be the hair of Ran, the goddess of the deep. To pull it from the water was to touch her gift, a gesture that demanded respect. Some families burned a small portion of their harvest before storage, offering the smoke back to the sea as thanks. It was not superstition, it was reciprocity. In recent years, oceanographic studies around the Lofoten Islands have found ancient seaweed beds still showing signs of selective harvest. The same sustainable pattern the Vikings used 1,000 years ago. They never stripped the sea bare. They took only what they could carry. Through the coldest months, seaweed and shellfish became their quiet salvation. When snow buried the land and wind roared through the longhouses, they boiled tang soup thickened with barley and dried fish. It smelled of salt and smoke, of endurance. And in those bowls, they didn't just eat, they remembered. Because each taste was proof that life still existed in the heart of winter. To the Vikings, survival was not about domination. It was about dialogue. The sea spoke. They listened. But while the ocean nourished their bodies, another gift sustained their hearts, a pale, living light that flowed from their herds and filled their homes with warmth. It was the white gold of the north, milk, cheese, and whey, the silent strength of the Viking hearth. Before the snow came, before the sea turned to iron, every Viking household prepared its most precious reserve, milk. Not for luxury, but for life. It was the one resource that could be renewed even when the earth froze. And from that pale liquid, they created the true wealth of the north, cheese, butter, and whey, the white gold that fed generations. The Vikings kept their animals close. sometimes inside the very walls of their longhouses. Goats, sheep, and cattle shared the same roof as their masters, their breath warming the air, their quiet movements echoing through the dark. At dawn, the women rose to milk them, whispering softly to calm the animals while frost glittered on the beams above. That milk was more than sustenance. It was survival in liquid form. In the sagas, milk was sacred to the goddess Freya, the giver of fertility and protection. It symbolized continuity, a reminder that even in the darkest winter, life still produced life. Every family guarded its own recipes for curdling and preserving it. Some used rennet from the stomach of calves, others relied on sour whey left from previous batches. The process was slow, rhythmic, and fragrant, the heartbeat of the Viking home. Cheese was both food and time capsule. Pressed into wheels and wrapped in moss or birch bark, it could last an entire year if kept cool. It traveled on ships, stored in linen sacks beside dried fish and barley. It was dense, salty, and tough, perfect for men who fought, sailed, and endured. Archaeologists have found traces of fermented dairy in clay pots from settlements across Scandinavia and even in Greenland, proof that the art of cheesemaking sailed with them wherever they went. Butter was rarer, a treasure made in summer when milk was abundant. It was churned by hand, sometimes mixed with herbs or sea salt, and stored in wooden barrels buried underground to keep it fresh. In some burial mounds, archaeologists discovered sealed butter jars still intact after 1,000 years, golden, pungent, and astonishingly preserved. To the Vikings, that wasn't coincidence. It was a message. Even their food knew how to wait for eternity. And then there was whey, the thin, translucent liquid left after the cheese was pressed. Nothing was wasted. They drank it, bathed wounds with it, and used it to pickle vegetables and meat. The lactic acid kept spoilage away, while the drink itself provided minerals and energy long after the cows stopped giving milk. Whey was the invisible thread that tied all nourishment together, the foundation of the Viking diet. Recent bioarchaeological analysis shows that Viking populations had a genetic adaptation for lactose tolerance much higher than neighboring peoples of their time. It meant evolution had followed their hunger, shaping their very DNA to match their dependence on milk. They didn't just live off the land reshaped them in return. In winter, when storms howled outside and the walls creaked under the weight of snow, families gathered around their hearths, dipping hard bread into bowls of warm milk or curdled cheese melted with herbs. The air smelled of smoke, straw, and salt. Children laughed softly. Elders told stories of the gods who had gifted them the milk of the world. In that moment, they weren't conquerors or explorers. They were simply human, fragile, warm, alive. To the Vikings, milk was not white. It was golden, glowing like light itself. The color of survival, the color of tomorrow. And just as the herds fed their families, the forests fed their souls. Because hidden beneath the pine and birch, another kind of medicine waited, small, sweet, and crimson. The berries that healed the blood and cured the cold. When the long nights came and the sea roared beyond the cliffs, the Vikings turned once more to the forest, their silent apothecary. There, beneath the moss and frost, they found color again, red, purple, black, and blue. The berries of the north, small suns that refused to die even when the sky turned gray. They called them burr, and gathered them at the edge of autumn when the air smelled of rain and smoke, cranberries, bilberries, lingonberries, crowberries, each a different note in the same song of survival. Women filled baskets woven from birch bark, their fingers stained crimson by juice, their breath visible in the cold. It was the last harvest before the snow, the forest's farewell. To the Vikings, berries were more than food. They were medicine, memory, and protection. They dried them over low embers or mashed them with honey, storing them in sealskin pouches that traveled across seas and generations. Mixed with animal fat, they became pastes to heal wounds. Fermented with barley, they became tonics for fever and exhaustion. In the North, sweetness was not indulgence, it was resilience. Modern analysis confirms their wisdom. Lingonberries and bilberries contain powerful antioxidants, anthocyanins that protect cells, strengthen vision, and purify the blood. Cranberries, rich in natural acids, prevent infections and act as preservatives. Without ever writing a single formula, The Vikings had mastered a biochemistry of endurance. In excavations near Borg and Kaupang, archaeologists discovered ceramic pots containing berry residues sealed under layers of soot, preserved like time capsules. The DNA of those berries matched modern Nordic species still growing today, untouched by cultivation. The forests, it seems, remembered their keepers. But the true power of these fruits was spiritual. To eat the first berries of the season was to renew the bond with the land. Their color, the color of blood, reminded the Vikings that they and the forest were made of the same substance, life feeding life, death returning to soil, soil feeding fruit, fruit feeding life again. It was a circle, and they honored it with reverence. During ceremonies for fertility and healing, berries were mixed into mead, the sacred honey wine offered to the gods. Their juice stained the drink deep red, symbolizing the union of sweetness and sacrifice. In that ritual, the line between medicine and myth dissolved. What healed the body also healed the spirit. The sagas tell that the goddess Air, patron of healing, carried a bowl of berries to the wounded after battle. Each fruit she offered was a promise. Pain would fade, warmth would return, and spring would rise again. The berries were hope you could hold in your hand. Even now in the northern forests, those same colors bloom under the same pale light. They taste of earth, frost, and endurance. A reminder that sometimes the smallest things, a handful of berries, a drop of honey, are what carry civilizations through the cold. And from that sweetness, another creation was born, a drink that preserved light itself. The golden fire that the Vikings called mead, the nectar of gods and mortals alike. Before wine, before beer, before the idea of civilization itself, there was mead, the drink of honey, water, and patience, a liquid born not from earth but from air and fire. To the Vikings, mead was more than alcohol. It was light captured in liquid form, the golden blood of the gods. The first recipe came not from books, but from accident. A hollow log filled with rainwater and wild honey began to ferment under the summer sun. When the Vikings drank from it, they felt warmth spreading through their chests, laughter rising from their lungs, and courage flowing through their veins. They called it mjödrur, and from that discovery, a ritual was born. To make mead was to make magic. Water from the fjord, honey from mountain hives, and sometimes a handful of berries or herbs, angelica, juniper, rowan. Everything mixed in clay jars or wooden vats, sealed with beeswax and left in darkness for weeks. The yeast worked in silence, turning sweetness into spirit. When the jars were finally opened, the air filled with the scent of summer, even in the heart of winter. Honey was precious. Every drop was guarded, traded, or offered to the gods. It was said that Odin himself had stolen mead from the giants, bringing inspiration and poetry to mankind. Each sip was a prayer to memory, courage, and creation. To share mead was to seal alliances, to mourn the dead, to celebrate survival. In the north, there was no line between drink and destiny. Archaeologists have found traces of honey wine and Viking drinking horns, still clinging to the inner resin after 1,000 years. Chemical analysis revealed not just honey, but traces of herbs, pollen, and berries, the fingerprints of local ecosystems preserved in liquid history. Every region had its own flavor, its own signature of light. During feasts, the passing of the mead horn followed strict order. The chieftain drank first, invoking the gods of war and weather. Then the horn passed to his kin, to his warriors, to the guests, each offering a toast to their ancestors. The ritual was not about intoxication. It was about remembrance. They weren't drinking to forget. They were drinking to remember who they were. Even in death, mead followed them. Clay jars filled with honey wine have been found in burial ships, placed beside the dead to accompany them into eternity. Because in the Viking mind, paradise was not silence. It was celebration. The afterlife was a feast without end, where warriors drank beneath golden rafters and laughter echoed like thunder. Modern science now tells us what the Vikings already knew intuitively. Maad's enzymes and probiotics strengthen the immune system, its sugars sustain energy, and its mild fermentation prevents decay. It was both pleasure and preservation, joy made useful. But beyond its chemistry, mead carried something deeper, a philosophy. It taught that patience creates strength, that light can be stored inside darkness, that sweetness survives even the bitterest winters. Every jar of mead was a small act of defiance against despair. And perhaps that is why the Vikings cherished it above all else, because in its golden glow they saw themselves, fierce, fleeting, and immortalized by warmth. The last drops of each batch were poured onto the ground as offering, soaking into the soil like sunlight returning to its source. And from that same soil, another miracle would one day rise, the hidden banquet buried beneath the earth, where food, memory, and ritual became one final message from the north. The earth. Beneath the grass and frost of the northern soil, archaeologists began to find something unexpected. Not weapons, not gold, but food. Buried under stones, sealed in clay, and wrapped in bark, they uncovered layers of meals preserved for over 1,000 years, echoes of banquets that never truly ended. In those hidden cellars of time, the Vikings had left their final message, that survival itself could be an offering. The discovery began in 2017 near an ancient farmstead in Iceland. At first, the excavation team believed they had found a burial mound, but when the soil was lifted, the pattern of the pit revealed something different, circular, deliberate, and filled with traces of ash, bones, and grain. It was not a tomb. It was a table. Inside the pit lay remains of dried fish, reindeer meat, barley bread, and fragments of ceramic jars once filled with mead and milk. Each item had been placed with precision, layer upon layer, as if arranged for guests who would arrive after death. It wasn't simply food storage, it was ritual preservation, a banquet prepared for the gods, the ancestors, and the world yet to come. Chemical analysis showed that the food had been cooked and cooled before burial, sealed with layers of clay and moss. This method kept it fresh for months, maybe longer. The Vikings had discovered natural refrigeration, not to hoard, but to give. Because when famine came, these hidden caches saved lives. And when death came, they nourished memory. To the Vikings, the act of burying food was not wasteful. It was sacred. They believed the earth would return what it was given. Each buried meal was a pact, a promise that abundance would one day rise again. It was gratitude made visible. In many of these sites, researchers also found animal skulls arranged in circles, often alongside charred bread or burned herbs. They were symbols of the cycle, the transformation of matter into spirit, a silent conversation between hunger and hope. When the team at Borg reconstructed one of these underground chambers, they discovered its astonishing efficiency. Even after months, the stored food showed almost no bacterial growth. The combination of clay, frost, and organic oils had created a natural vacuum, a prehistoric refrigerator designed with mathematical precision. Once again, the Vikings proved that their survival was no accident. It was architecture. It was science. It was faith. As the last light faded from the dig site, one archaeologist whispered, "They weren't hiding food. They were hiding gratitude." And perhaps that was the truth. That in a world of scarcity, the greatest wealth was the will to share. Because beneath the soil, the Vikings didn't just bury what they had, they buried what they believed in. That every meal was a story. That every harvest deserved remembrance. That nothing truly ends if it is offered with purpose. Even now, when the Arctic wind blows across those northern fields, the earth still exhales faint traces of smoke and salt, the breath of old fires, the scent of a feast waiting to be remembered. The Vikings taught that food was not only nourishment, but connection, a thread that ties the living to the dead and the past to what still comes. They turned survival into ritual, and ritual into legacy. And that legacy still whispers today in every home warmed by bread, in every sip of mead, in every story told beside a flame. Because the North was never just a place. It was a memory that learned to feed itself. And if you wish to keep that memory alive, if you want to uncover the secrets that time tried to silence, then keep watching the other stories of this channel. The feast of the North is far from over. It's waiting, beneath the next story, beneath the next flame, beneath the next voice that dares to remember.
Welcome back. You know, it's like I was saying in the beginning. What were the feasts like for the Viking people? What was it like living, here in North America, even up into Canada, and a few other places throughout the world where we're watched at? We experience winter, but what was it like in Scandinavia, in that whole region in Northern Europe, right on the edge of the polar region? I knew that there was a little bit of unspoken history to it, but I was really surprised to find that a lot of the foods that they consumed had properties to it that just aren't thought of today. A lot of the ways that they prepared and preserved food is just lost to history. It's hard nowadays with everything being processed and having all these man-made additives and preservatives, that the simplest ways that they used 1,000 years ago to store their food, prepare their food, preserve their food, preserved it in ways that we have lost for time periods that seem inconceivable. A lot can be learned looking back at some of those ancient cultures in our history. Like I said in the beginning, it is December. It is the last month of the year. Today is the 5th. We got 20 days till Christmas. And of course, we're going to keep up the videos about Yule, about the origins, about the practices, about the history and the mystery. But that's all I've got for you today. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. God bless you. God love you. We do. We will see you in history.